Have you ever noticed how some of the most important moments in life often come when we least expect them? A small gesture, a random event, or even a gust of wind can sometimes open the door to a completely new chapter. This is exactly what happened to David, a young man living in the heart of Japan's bustling city life. David was in many ways like any other young professional. He had a steady job, a small apartment, and a routine that gave him stability. On the surface, his life was peaceful, yet hidden in the quiet hours after work, he sometimes felt the silence of being alone. The city outside was alive with lights, sounds, and people moving in every direction. But inside his apartment, it was just him, his books, his meals, and the sound of his thoughts. He never saw his life as sad or incomplete. In fact, he often told himself that solitude allowed him to reflect and grow. But deep down, he sometimes wondered what it might feel like to share those everyday moments with someone else. Not through grand adventures or dramatic experiences, but through something as simple as enjoying a cup of tea together or sharing a laugh at the end of a long day. One ordinary afternoon, while David stood on the terrace overlooking the endless city skyline, something unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind swept across the rooftops and carried with it a small object, lightweight trinket that landed right near his feet. Surprised, David bent down to pick it up. It seemed out of place, almost like it had wandered into his life by accident. He turned it over in his hands, wondering where it came from. Just then, he heard a gentle but clear voice calling from the next balcony. It was Mio, the girl who lived in the apartment beside his. Her voice carried warmth as she called out, explaining that the little object belonged to her. In that moment, something shifted. What could have been just a casual return of a misplaced item suddenly became the start of a conversation, one that David found himself enjoying more than he expected. Mio smiled with ease, her words lighthearted and friendly. She had a way of turning a simple exchange into something that felt refreshing, almost like a breeze that clears the air after a long day. When David handed the object back to her, it was more than just a polite gesture. It was, unknowingly, the beginning of a bond. From that moment forward, the walls of routine that had surrounded him began to feel less solid. He didn't know it yet, but the path of his life was about to change in a way he could never have planned. What makes this story meaningful is not the dramatic twist of fate, but rather the reminder it gives us. Sometimes, life changes not through grand events, but through the smallest, simplest encounters. It teaches us that we don't always need to search far and wide for happiness. Sometimes, it comes quietly from right next door. And so, with a single gust of wind and a brief conversation, David's world began to open. What started as a simple introduction would slowly unfold into something deeper, something that carried lessons about connection, kindness, and the unexpected ways love can grow. After that first exchange on the terrace, David and Mio began to notice each other more often. Mio would stop by to ask how his day had gone, and David found himself surprised at how much lighter he felt when talking with her. At first, it was small gestures, a smile in the hallway, a quick wave when their paths crossed. But soon, these small moments grew into conversations. It wasn't about deep, complex topics. Sometimes it was as simple as her sharing a funny story from work, or him mentioning a book he had just read. But in those ordinary conversations, there was a sense of ease and connection that David hadn't experienced in a long time. Mio also had a thoughtful habit of bringing little things whenever she visited. One day, it was a slice of cake she had picked up from a bakery. Another time, it was a cup of milk tea she thought he might enjoy. To David, these gestures were more than just snacks. They were reminders that someone cared enough to think of him during their day. It was these small acts of kindness that slowly softened the quiet edges of his solitary life. The more time they spent together, the more David began to notice how natural it felt to have Mio around. They laughed easily, shared stories of their childhood, and even began to cook meals together on weekends. What surprised him most was how ordinary activities suddenly became moments he looked forward to, simply because Mio was there. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions. Their bond grew quietly, built on trust, consistency, and the comfort of being understood. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. It wasn't a sudden realization, but rather a steady awareness. They had become an important part of each other's lives. David, who once thought of his apartment as a place of solitude, now felt it becoming a home filled with warmth and laughter. David looked at Mio and realized how much had changed. Mio, with her kindness and her ability to bring joy into the simplest of situations, had become more than just a neighbor. She had become the person he couldn't imagine his life without. And so, when the time was right, they decided to build a future together, and marriage became the natural continuation of the story they had been writing side by side. This turning point in David's life was not about a dramatic twist of fate, but about realizing the value of everyday love, the kind that grows from consistency, patience, and genuine care. It was proof that happiness doesn't always come with fireworks or surprises. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a neighbor who becomes your best friend and eventually your partner for life. David and Mio's story shows that love isn't built on grand gestures, but on small, consistent acts of care. Happiness grows quietly through shared meals, kind words, and patience. True connection comes not from drama, but from presence, respect, and openness, reminding us to treasure ordinary moments. David and Mio's story began with a simple gust of wind, yet it grew into a lifelong bond. What seemed like chance was built on kindness, patience, and everyday gestures that created trust and love. Their marriage wasn't about dramatic events, but about valuing ordinary moments, shared laughter, small surprises, quiet support. Happiness doesn't require wealth or grandeur. It thrives in gratitude, consistency, and presence. For younger viewers, it shows patience and sincerity matter in building relationships. For older ones, it reminds us that new chapters can begin even in routine. Ultimately, their story teaches us to notice the people around us, embrace small acts of kindness, and recognize the extraordinary within the ordinary.